December 14th, 2019. A frail, trembling boy collapsed at the doorstep of the poorest teacher in Millbrook, clutching nothing but a torn photograph and begging for a single meal. What Thomas Brennan did next would cost him everything he had, his savings, his reputation, even his health. But 20 years later, when a fleet of black SUVs rolled into town searching for him, the truth behind that one act of kindness would shock the entire community. Could a decision made in desperation really transform two lives so completely that one man's sacrifice would become another man's empire? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Brennan had exactly $47 in his checking account when he heard the knock. It was the kind of weak, hesitant knock that could easily be mistaken for a branch scraping against wood. But something about its rhythm made him look up from the stack of ungraded essays covering his kitchen table. The December wind howled outside his small rental house on Maple Street, rattling the single-pane windows that his landlord had promised to replace 3 winters ago. He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping against the worn linoleum floor, and made his way to the front door. Through the frosted glass panel, he could make out a small silhouette hunched against the cold. When Thomas opened the door, the blast of freezing air hit him first, followed immediately by the sight that would change everything. The boy couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. His clothes hung off his skeletal frame like they belonged to someone twice his size. A threadbare jacket with a broken zipper, jeans with holes at both knees, and shoes that were more duct tape than leather. But it was his face that stopped Thomas cold. Hollow cheeks, chapped lips split and bleeding, and eyes that held the kind of emptiness Thomas had only seen once before. In the mirror, during his own childhood, the boy's legs gave out and he crumpled against the doorframe. Thomas caught him just before he hit the concrete porch, shocked by how little the child weighed. It was like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I just need something to eat, anything. I can work for it. I can clean or..." His words dissolved into a coughing fit that shook his entire body. Thomas felt the tremors through his arms as he held the boy upright. Without thinking, without calculating, without considering what he could or couldn't afford, Thomas made a decision. "Come inside," he said, half carrying the boy across the threshold. "Let's get you warm first." The boy's name was Marcus Chen, though it took nearly an hour before he could speak clearly enough to tell Thomas that much. By then, Thomas had wrapped him in every blanket he owned, seated him at the kitchen table, and was heating up the last can of chicken soup from his nearly empty pantry. He'd planned to make that soup last 2 meals, lunch tomorrow and maybe dinner if he stretched it thin enough. Those plans evaporated the moment he saw Marcus try to hold the spoon with hands that shook so badly most of the soup spilled before it reached his mouth. Thomas ended up feeding him, spoonful by careful spoonful, while Marcus's eyes welled with tears he was too proud or too exhausted to shed. Between sips, the story came out in fragments. Marcus had been living in the Riverside group home until 3 months ago. The state had run out of funding, and the facility closed with barely a week's notice. The foster system was overwhelmed, placements were scarce, and somehow Marcus had fallen through the cracks. He'd been bouncing between temporary shelters, sleeping in bus stations, eating from dumpsters behind restaurants. He'd walked past Thomas's house dozens of times over the past month, always late at night when he thought no one would see him, watching through the windows as Thomas graded papers under the dim kitchen light. "You always looked kind," Marcus said, his voice still hoarse. "Not like you'd call the cops right away. I thought maybe you'd give me just 1 meal before turning me in." Thomas felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd been teaching 7th grade English at Millbrook Middle School for 15 years, ever since he'd scraped together enough financial aid and student loans to finish his education degree. He recognized the look in Marcus's eyes because he'd worn it himself once, back when he was 9 years old, and his own mother had abandoned him at a fire station with nothing but a note saying she couldn't do it anymore. The soup was gone too quickly. Marcus's eyes kept darting toward the empty bowl, then away, ashamed of his own hunger. Thomas opened his refrigerator and stared at its contents. 2 eggs, half a loaf of bread that was still good, a quarter stick of butter, and some wilted lettuce. His paycheck wasn't due for another 5 days. He'd been planning to make those 2 eggs last, scrambling half an egg at a time to stretch them out. He cracked both eggs into a pan while they cooked. He toasted 4 slices of bread, half the loaf, and slathered them with most of the remaining butter. When he set the plate in front of Marcus, the boy stared at it like it was a hallucination. "Eat," Thomas said simply. Marcus devoured the eggs and toast in less than 3 minutes, then sat back with a shuddering breath that might have been a sob. "Thank you," he whispered. "I should go now, before it gets too late. There's a shelter on 5th Street that sometimes—" "It's December 14th, Thomas interrupted. "It's 23 degrees outside, and that shelter closed down last month due to a pipe burst. I know because 3 of my students ended up homeless when it happened." Marcus's face fell. "I'll find somewhere. The library stays open until 8. After that, there's a laundromat on. You'll stay here tonight." The words came out before Thomas had fully thought them through, but once they were spoken, he couldn't imagine saying anything else. Marcus looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts hope and disbelief. "I can't pay you," Marcus said. "I don't have any money. I don't have anything. I'm not asking you to pay me. I'm asking you to stay on that couch for one night, so I don't spend the entire weekend wondering if you froze to death in some—" "Ellie." Thomas grabbed the stack of essays from the table and moved them to the kitchen counter. "I have to finish grading these tonight, but you can watch TV if you want. Remote's on the coffee table. There's not much on cable. I only have basic, but it's something." Marcus didn't move. "Why are you doing this?" It was a fair question, and Thomas didn't have a simple answer. How do you explain to a 12-year-old boy that the trajectory of your entire life can hinge on whether someone shows you kindness when you need it most? How do you tell him that 30 years ago, a firefighter named Captain Rodriguez hadn't just taken a scared 9-year-old into the station that night, but had spent the next 3 hours sitting with him, sharing his dinner, and promising him that not all adults were like his mother? That one night had given Thomas enough hope to survive the foster system, enough belief in human decency to keep trying, enough faith to eventually become a teacher who wanted to be for other kids what Captain Rodriguez had been for him. "Because someone did it for me once," Thomas finally said. "Now go watch TV before I change my mind." Marcus's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. He stood up slowly, still wrapped in blankets, and shuffled toward the couch. Within minutes, the sound of a sitcom laugh track filled the small house, and Thomas returned to his essays with a strange feeling in his chest, something he couldn't quite name, but that felt suspiciously like purpose. That one night turned into 2, then 3, then a week. Thomas called in a favor with Janet Holloway, the school counselor who'd helped him navigate his own troubled past when he was a student teacher. She made some calls, pulled some strings, and confirmed what Thomas already suspected. Marcus was officially listed as a runaway, but with the overwhelmed system and his lack of family, no one was actively looking for him. The state would eventually catch up, but for now, Marcus existed in a bureaucratic blind spot. "What are you planning to do?" Janet asked over the phone, her voice heavy with concern. "Thomas, I know that look in your voice. You're thinking about doing something stupid and noble." "I'm thinking about keeping him fed until the system catches up," Thomas replied, watching Marcus through the kitchen doorway as the boy carefully folded the blankets he'd used, trying to take up as little space as possible. "That's not stupid. It is when you're living on a teacher's salary and barely making rent yourself. How are you going to feed 2 people on what you make?" Thomas didn't have an answer to that. His salary was $38,000 a year, barely enough to cover his $800 monthly rent, utilities, his student loan payments, and basic groceries. He'd been surviving on rice, beans, and whatever discounted meat he could find at the grocery store. Adding another mouth to feed, especially one that was malnourished and needed proper nutrition, was going to require sacrifices he hadn't fully calculated yet. But every time he considered calling social services, he'd remember the way Marcus had collapsed on his doorstep, the way his hands had shaken holding that spoon, the way he'd apologized for being hungry. And Thomas knew that whatever he had to sacrifice, it would be worth it if it meant this kid didn't have to spend another night wondering where his next meal was coming from. The first real test came 4 days after Marcus arrived. When Thomas's paycheck hit his account, he sat at his computer staring at the balance, $2,847.63 after taxes and automatic deductions. His rent was due in 6 days. His utilities would auto-pay the following week. His student loan payment would withdraw automatically on the 28th. After doing the math 3 times, he realized he had roughly $450 for groceries and any unexpected expenses for the entire month. For one person, that would have been tight but manageable. For 2 people, one of whom was recovering from severe malnutrition, it was going to be nearly impossible. Thomas opened a new tab and started researching. He found a food bank on the east side of town that distributed boxes of groceries twice a month, no questions asked. He discovered that the Millbrook Community Church ran a free meal program every Tuesday and Thursday evening. He learned which grocery stores marked down their nearly expired food at what times, and he began planning his shopping trips around those schedules. He also made a harder decision. He called the internet company and canceled his service. That would save him $65 a month. He couldn't cancel his phone because the school needed to be able to reach him. But he downgraded to the cheapest plan available, saving another $30. He looked at his car insurance, his heating bill, every single expense, searching for places to cut. Marcus noticed immediately. On the 3rd day after the internet disappeared, he found Thomas at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and a calculator. The stress evident in every line of his face. "You're spending your money on me," Marcus said quietly from the doorway. It wasn't a question. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas looked up, caught off guard. "I'm managing my budget. That's what adults do. You had the internet before. Now you don't. You used to turn the heat up higher. Now the house is cold and you wear extra sweaters." Marcus stepped into the kitchen, his thin frame swimming in one of Thomas's old sweatshirts. "I'm making everything harder for you." "No," Thomas said firmly, closing his laptop. "You're making things different, not harder. There's a distinction. I should leave. I can go back to the shelters or maybe—" "Marcus, sit down." The boy sat, his expression guarded, prepared for rejection. Thomas took a breath and chose his words carefully. "When I was 9 years old, my mother left me at a fire station, just dropped me off and drove away. I spent the next 9 years bouncing through foster homes, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like I belonged. I ate a lot of cheap food, wore a lot of second-hand clothes, and spent most of my childhood feeling like I was an inconvenience to everyone around me." Thomas leaned forward, making sure Marcus was listening. "The only thing that got me through it was the handful of people who showed me that I mattered. A firefighter who shared his dinner with me, a foster parent who actually remembered my birthday one year, a high school teacher who stayed after school to tutor me for free. They didn't have to do any of that, but they did, and it made the difference between me giving up and me graduating college." Marcus's eyes were locked on Thomas's face, barely blinking. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel grateful or obligated," Thomas continued. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand something. You're not an inconvenience. You're not a burden. You're a kid who needs help, and I'm an adult who can provide it. Yes, it means I have to adjust my budget. Yes, it means making some sacrifices. But those are my choices, and I'm making them because I want to, not because you forced me to." The silence stretched between them for a long moment. Then Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I can't pay you back? What if I turn out to be not worth it?" Thomas felt the weight of that question settle over the kitchen like snow. This was the real fear. the one that lived at the core of every abandoned child's heart, the terror that maybe they'd been left behind because they were fundamentally unworthy of love. Then, nothing changes, Thomas said. Because I'm not keeping a tab, Marcus. I'm not expecting you to pay me back with money or success or anything else. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, period. Whether you grow up to cure cancer or work at a gas station, whether you remember my name in 20 years or forget I existed, it doesn't matter. What matters is that right now, at this moment, you need help and I can give it. Marcus looked down at his hands, blinking rapidly. When he finally spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. Can I stay? Not just tonight, but longer. We'll figure it out, Thomas promised, though he had no idea how he was going to make it work. One day at a time. That conversation became the foundation of their unspoken agreement. Marcus would stay, and Thomas would make it work somehow. What neither of them realized that December night was just how much making it work would cost. The next 3 months tested Thomas in ways he hadn't anticipated. The food bank helped, but it wasn't enough to feed a growing boy who was trying to recover from months of malnutrition. Thomas started skipping lunch at school, claiming he wasn't hungry while he saved his meal money for groceries. He lost 12 pounds by February, and his clothes hung looser on his already thin frame. His colleagues noticed. Sarah Martinez, the science teacher who'd shared lunch duty with him for 5 years, cornered him in the teacher's lounge one afternoon. "You're not eating," she said bluntly, blocking his exit. "Don't lie to me, Thomas. I've watched you pretend to eat an apple for lunch 3 days in a row. What's going on?" Thomas considered lying, but Sarah had eyes like a hawk and the persistence of a bloodhound. "I'm managing a tight budget right now. It's temporary." "How temporary?" "Because you look like you're about 2 weeks away from needing medical intervention." She crossed her arms. "Is this about a kid? Please tell me you're not doing something insane like taking in a stray teenager." His silence was answer enough. "Oh, Thomas." Sarah's expression shifted from anger to concern. "You can't save everyone. You know that, right? You're one teacher with one income, and you're barely surviving yourself. I'm not trying to save everyone. Just one kid who needed help. And what happens when you collapse from malnutrition? What happens to that kid then?" Sarah pulled out her phone. "I'm going to do something, and you're going to let me do it because you're too proud to ask for help yourself. I'm posting in the teachers' group chat that we're doing a food drive for a family in need. No names, no details, just a request for non-perishable items and gift cards. You're going to accept whatever people bring, understood?" Thomas wanted to argue, but the truth was he was drowning. The past 3 months had drained his savings, maxed out his one credit card, and left him lying awake at night doing impossible math in his head, trying to figure out how to stretch £127 until the next payday. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Understood," he whispered. The teachers at Millbrook Middle School came through in ways that made Thomas's throat tighten with gratitude. Within a week, he had 3 boxes of groceries sitting on his kitchen counter. Pasta, rice, canned vegetables, peanut butter, cereal, and even some treats like cookies and juice boxes. There were also 6 $25 gift cards to the local grocery store, given anonymously through Sarah. It was enough to ease the immediate crisis, but Thomas knew it wasn't sustainable. He needed a long-term solution, something more permanent than charity. He needed to become Marcus's legal guardian. The process was more complicated than he'd imagined. First, he had to officially report Marcus to Child Services, which meant admitting that he'd been harboring a runaway for 3 months. Then came the home inspections, the background checks, the interviews with social workers who looked at his bank statements and asked pointed questions about his ability to provide for a child. The social worker assigned to their case, a woman named Patricia Vance, sat in Thomas's living room and reviewed his financial documents with a frown that deepened with each page. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but I have serious concerns about your financial stability. Your income is barely above the poverty line for a single person, let alone someone attempting to raise a child. Your savings account is empty. You have credit card debt. Your monthly expenses exceed your monthly income. I'm making it work, Thomas said, hating how defensive he sounded. Marcus is fed, clothed, and attending school now. He's healthy. For now, Patricia interrupted. But what happens when he needs new shoes? What happens if he gets sick and needs medical care? What happens if your car breaks down and you can't get to work? She set down the papers and looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. I'm not trying to be cruel, Mr. Brennan. I'm trying to be realistic. The court requires guardians to demonstrate financial stability, and right now, you're demonstrating the opposite. Marcus, who'd been listening from the hallway, appeared in the doorway. So what are you saying? That I have to leave? Patricia turned to him with a softer expression. I'm saying that Mr. Brennan needs to show the court that he can provide for you long-term. That might mean finding additional income, reducing his expenses, or what? Marcus's voice rose, panic creeping in. Going back to the system? Waiting for another foster placement that'll never come? I was starving before I came here. Actually starving. And now I'm not. Isn't that worth something? Of course it is, Patricia said gently. But the law requires more than good intentions. It requires proof of stability. After she left, Thomas and Marcus sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Thomas spoke. I'm not giving up. I'll figure this out. How? Marcus asked, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded truly hopeless. You're already working yourself into the ground. You're already not eating enough. What else are you supposed to do? Thomas didn't have an answer that night, but lying in bed later, staring at the ceiling and listening to Marcus's breathing from the couch in the living room, he made a decision. He'd find a second job. He'd work nights and weekends. He'd do whatever it took to show the court that he could provide for this kid who'd stumbled into his life, and somehow become the most important thing in it. The next day, he started applying for every evening and weekend position he could find. Thomas found work at Fletcher's hardware store, stocking shelves from 6 to midnight, 4 nights a week. The pay was $12 an hour. Not much, but enough to tip his monthly income into the range that might satisfy Patricia Vance and the family court. What the pay didn't account for was the cost it extracted from everything else. His first shift started on a Tuesday, which meant leaving Marcus alone from the moment Thomas got home from school until well past midnight. He'd prepared dinner in advance, spaghetti with meat sauce that Marcus could reheat, and left detailed instructions about locking the doors, not answering for strangers, and calling Thomas's cell phone if anything went wrong. I'll be fine, Marcus had said, though his eyes betrayed his nervousness. At 13 now, he'd grown 3 inches since arriving 6 months ago, but he still had the wariness of someone who'd learned that safety was never guaranteed. It's just a few hours. 6 hours, Thomas corrected, hating the words even as he spoke them. And you have school tomorrow, so don't wait up. Get your homework done, eat dinner and go to bed by 9:30. Marcus nodded, but they both knew he wouldn't sleep until he heard Thomas's key in the lock. The hardware store job was mind-numbing work. Unpacking boxes, organizing inventory, facing products so their labels pointed forward on the shelves. Thomas's manager, a man named Derek Patterson, who couldn't have been more than 25, treated the work with the solemnity of a military operation, inspecting Thomas's shelves with a critical eye and pointing out microscopic imperfections. The paint cans need to be rotated so the labels all face the same direction, Derek said on the 3rd night, his voice dripping with the kind of authority that came from a clipboard and a polo shirt with manager embroidered on it. And this entire section of screws is organized wrong. They need to be sorted by length first, then by thread type, Thomas, who held a master's degree in education and had spent 15 years teaching children how to think critically about literature, bit his tongue and reorganized the screws. His back ached from bending and lifting. His feet throbbed in the cheap shoes he'd bought at a discount store because his teaching shoes weren't made for standing on concrete for 6 hours. But the paycheck would come in 2 weeks, and that paycheck meant he could show the court that his monthly income had increased by nearly $2,000. He made it through April and into May on a combination of stubbornness and caffeine. His teaching suffered, he couldn't deny that. He fell asleep during his planning period twice, once waking to find his face pressed against a stack of vocabulary quizzes with red ink smeared across his cheek. His students noticed his exhaustion, whispering among themselves when he snapped at a usually tolerated disruption, or when he needed to read a passage twice. Before he could remember what he'd just said, Principal Donovan called him into her office on a Thursday afternoon, closing the door with a gentle click that somehow felt ominous. "Thomas, I'm going to be direct with you because I respect you too much to dance around this," she said, settling into her chair with the air of someone about to deliver bad news. "Your performance this semester has been concerning. You're late with grades, your lesson plans are increasingly sparse, and I've had 3 parents email me about your lack of engagement during parent-teacher conferences." Thomas opened his mouth to defend himself, but Eleanor Donovan held up a hand. "I'm not finished. I also know that you're working a second job at Fletcher's Hardware, and I can guess why. Zara mentioned, in the strictest confidence, that you've taken in a child who needed help. Is that correct?" Thomas nodded, too tired to construct a proper denial. "I admire what you're trying to do. Truly I do. But Thomas, you're burning out, and when you burn out, your students suffer. All of them." She leaned forward, her expression softening. "You can't pour from an empty cup. You can't teach effectively when you're running on 4 hours of sleep and working yourself into exhaustion. Something has to give. I can't quit the hardware store," Thomas said quietly. "I need the income to prove to family court that I can provide for Marcus. Without it, they'll take him away and put him back in the system, and if you collapse from exhaustion, if you lose your teaching job because your performance continues to decline, what happens to Marcus then?" It was the same argument Sarah had made months ago, and Thomas still didn't have a good answer. He was trapped between 2 impossible choices: work himself to death to keep Marcus, or prioritize his own health and lose the kid who'd become like a son to him. "I'll figure it out," he said. The words hollow, even to his own ears. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then pulled out a business card from her desk drawer. "This is Dr. Rachel Kim. She runs a free clinic on the west side that also offers counseling services and can connect people with community resources. I want you to call her, not as a professional requirement, but as a personal favor to me. Sometimes the solution isn't working harder. It's finding resources you didn't know existed." Thomas took the card, though he had no intention of calling. He didn't have time for counseling sessions or hunting down resources. He barely had time to sleep, but Marcus made him call. It happened on a Saturday morning in late May. Thomas had worked the closing shift at the hardware store the night before, getting home at 12:45 a.m. He'd set his alarm for 6 a.m. because he'd promised Marcus they'd go to the farmer's market together, one of their few shared activities that didn't cost money. When the alarm went off, Thomas reached over to silence it and discovered his arm wouldn't move properly. His entire body felt like it had been filled with concrete. He must have fallen back asleep, because the next thing he knew, Marcus was shaking his shoulder, his voice high with panic. Thomas, wake up! It's almost noon. You missed the farmer's market. Are you okay? Should I call 911? Thomas forced his eyes open, his head pounding with a headache that felt like his skull was splitting. I'm fine, just overslept. You've been asleep for 13 hours. That's not oversleeping, that's your body shutting down. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, his face drawn with worry. You're killing yourself with these 2 jobs. I can see it. Everyone can see it. I'm managing. You're not managing anything. You're barely surviving. Marcus pulled out the business card that Thomas had left on his dresser. The one from Dr. Rachel Kim. Call this number, please. If not for yourself, then for me, because I can't watch you destroy yourself over me. The naked fear in Marcus's voice cut through Thomas's exhaustion. He'd been so focused on proving he could provide for Marcus that he hadn't considered what it was doing to the kid to watch him suffer. Marcus had already lost everyone else in his life. The thought of losing Thomas too, even if it was just to burnout and exhaustion, must have been terrifying. Okay, Thomas whispered. I'll call on Monday. Dr. Rachel Kim's clinic was housed in a converted church on the western edge of Millbrook, its white paint peeling and its parking lot full of potholes. But inside it hummed with purposeful activity. The waiting room was crowded with people of all ages, and the receptionist greeted Thomas with a warmth that felt genuine rather than professional. Dr. Kim herself was a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that reminded Thomas of his favorite college professor. She listened to his situation without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, nodding occasionally but mostly just absorbing information. When he finished, she set down her pen and looked at him directly. "You're aware that what you're doing isn't sustainable, correct?" "Everyone keeps telling me that, because it's true. You're exhibiting classic signs of caregiver burnout, chronic exhaustion, physical symptoms, emotional depletion. If you continue on this path, you will collapse. It's not a matter of if, but when." She picked up her pen again. "However, I'm not here to lecture you about self-care, though you clearly need it. I'm here to help you find solutions. Tell me about the guardianship case." Thomas explained the financial requirements, Patricia Vance's concerns. The court date scheduled for July 15th, just 6 weeks away. Dr. Kim made more notes, then reached for her phone. "I'm calling someone. Don't worry, this isn't a betrayal of confidence. It's a connection to resources." The someone turned out to be Wallace Hunt, a family law attorney who did pro bono work for cases involving foster children and guardianship disputes. He arrived at the clinic 40 minutes later, a tall black man in his 60s, wearing a suit that had seen better days but was still impeccably. He pressed, "Dr. Kim tells me you're trying to gain guardianship of a teenage boy while working 2 jobs and barely staying afloat financially," Wallace said, settling into the chair next to Thomas with a leather portfolio. "Walk me through the case from the beginning." Thomas told the story again, Marcus collapsing on his doorstep, the months of barely surviving, Patricia Vance's concerns, the hardware store job, all of it. Wallace listened with the intensity of someone who'd heard 1,000 similar stories, but still found each one worthy of his full attention. "The court's concern is legitimate," Wallace said when Thomas finished, "but it's also narrow-minded. They're looking at your current financial snapshot without considering your trajectory or your commitment. That's what we're going to change." He opened his portfolio and pulled out a legal pad. "First, we're going to quit that hardware store job." "I can't." "Yes, you can, because it's destroying your primary income source. If you lose your teaching job, you lose everything. The hardware store is a band-aid on a bullet wound. It creates the illusion of financial stability while actually undermining your real stability." Wallace held up a hand before Thomas could protest. "Instead, we're going to build a different case. We're going to show the court that you have community support, that you've created a stable home environment for Marcus despite financial limitations, and that your teaching career provides consistent, long-term income even if it's not extravagant. Will that be enough?" "I don't know," Wallace said honestly. "But it's a better strategy than working yourself into an early grave. Patricia Vance is good at her job, which means she genuinely wants what's best for Marcus. Our job is to show her that what's best for Marcus is staying with you, even if your bank account isn't impressive." Over the next 2 weeks, Wallace worked with Thomas to build their case. They gathered letters of recommendation from Thomas's colleagues, documenting his character and stability. They compiled Marcus's school records, showing his dramatic improvement, from a kid who'd barely been attending school to a student pulling straight B's and perfect attendance. They documented the community support system, the food bank they used, the church meal programs, the teachers who'd contributed to their supplies. Most importantly, Wallace convinced Thomas to quit the hardware store. "You've proven you're willing to work yourself to death for this kid," Wallace said. "Now prove you're willing to make smart decisions for his long-term well-being. That means maintaining the career that provides your real stability." Thomas gave his 2 weeks' notice to Derek Patterson, who seemed more annoyed about having to find a replacement than concerned about Thomas's well-being. His last shift was on June 12th. exactly 2 months after his first. He walked out of Fletcher's Hardware at midnight, exhausted and relieved in equal measure, and drove home to find Marcus waiting up for him despite explicit instructions to go to bed. "Last shift," Thomas said. Hanging his keys on the hook by the door, Marcus's face flooded with relief. "You really quit?" "I really quit. Wallace thinks we have a better chance if I focus on being a good teacher and showing the court that we have stability, even if we're not wealthy." Thomas dropped onto the couch, his entire body aching. No more midnight shifts, no more reorganizing screws by thread type. Just teaching and trying to be a decent guardian. "You're already a decent guardian," Marcus said quietly. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." Thomas felt his throat tighten. In 6 months, he and Marcus had built something that felt dangerously close to family, and the thought of losing it to a court decision was unbearable. "We'll find out if that's enough on July 15th. The weeks leading up to the court hearing crawled by with agonizing slowness. Wallace prepared them for what to expect. Questions about finances, living arrangements, Marcus's schooling, and their relationship. He coached Marcus on how to speak to the judge, honest but not rehearsed, showing his own personality while making it clear he wanted to stay with Thomas. "The judge will ask you if you feel safe with Mr. Brennan," Wallace explained during one of their preparation sessions. "Answer honestly. Don't exaggerate or try to make things sound better than they are. Judges can smell bullshit from a mile away." "I do feel safe," Marcus said. "For the first time in my life, I actually feel safe." The honesty in his voice made Thomas's chest ache. July 15th arrived with the kind of oppressive summer heat that made Millbrook feel like it was slowly melting into the pavement. Thomas put on his one good suit, the same one he'd worn to his college graduation 15 years ago and which now hung a bit loose after his months of inadequate eating. Marcus wore khakis and a button-down shirt that Sarah Martinez had bought him specifically for the hearing, and together they drove to the county courthouse in silence, both too nervous to speak. The courtroom was smaller than Thomas had expected, and somehow that made it more intimidating. Judge Margaret Sellers was a woman in her late 50s with steel-grey hair and reading glasses that she peered over with the intensity of someone who'd seen every possible variation of human behavior and wasn't impressed by most of it. Patricia Vance presented her report first, outlining her concerns about Thomas's financial stability. She was professional but firm, making it clear that while she believed Thomas had good intentions, intentions weren't enough to raise a child. Mr. Brennan's annual income is $38,000, which places him barely above the poverty line for a household of 2, Patricia said, reading from her notes. He has no significant savings, carries credit card debt, and has had to rely on community support, including food banks and charitable contributions from colleagues. While I don't question his commitment to Marcus Chen, I have serious concerns about his ability to provide long-term financial stability. Wallace stood to present their counter-argument, and Thomas watched him transform into something formidable. He presented the letters of recommendation, Marcus's school records, documentation of Thomas's 15-year teaching career and his upcoming tenure review, which would increase his salary by $4,000 annually. "Your Honor, the state's concern is understandable but misguided," Wallace said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd argued 100 similar cases. "They're looking at a bank balance and seeing poverty. I'm looking at the same situation and seeing resourcefulness, commitment, and the kind of stability that doesn't show up on a financial spreadsheet. Marcus Chen was starving when he found Mr. Brennan. Now he's thriving. He's attending school regularly, maintaining good grades, and for the first time in his life, he has an adult who puts his needs first." Judge Sellers made a note, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Hunt, I appreciate your passionate defense, but the reality is that raising a child requires financial resources. Medical care, clothing, food, housing, these things cost money. What happens when Marcus needs braces? What happens if he wants to participate in sports or extracurricular activities? What happens if Mr. Brennan's car breaks down and he can't afford to fix it? Then they'll deal with it the same way millions of working-class families deal with it, through community support, payment plans, and creative problem-solving, Wallace replied without missing a beat. Your Honor, if financial abundance were a requirement for guardianship, we'd have to remove children from half the homes in this county. The standard isn't wealth, it's adequacy and stability. Mr. Brennan has demonstrated both. The judge turned her attention to Marcus. Mr. Chen, you're 13 years old, which means the court will take your preferences into consideration. Do you want to remain with Mr. Brennan? Marcus stood up, his hands clasped in front of him, and when he spoke his voice was steady despite the tremor Thomas could see in his shoulders. Yes, Your Honor, I know we don't have a lot of money. I know Mr. Brennan struggles sometimes to make everything work. But before I met him, I didn't care if I lived or died. I was eating from dumpsters and sleeping in bus stations, and I thought that was just going to be my life until I aged out of the system or died from exposure. He paused, blinking rapidly. Mr. Brennan taught me that I'm worth taking care of. He taught me that I matter. I don't need expensive things or a big house. I just need someone who actually wants me around, and that's what I have with him. The courtroom was silent when Marcus sat down. Judge Sellers made several more notes, her pen scratching across the paper with what felt like deliberate slowness. Finally she looked up. This case presents a difficult decision. On one hand, I have serious concerns about the financial viability of this placement. On the other hand, Marcus is clearly thriving in ways that can't be measured by income alone. She paused, and Thomas felt his heart hammering so hard he was certain everyone could hear it. I'm going to grant temporary guardianship for a period of 1 year, with quarterly check-ins from the Department of Child Services. Mr. Brennan, you will be required to maintain steady employment, provide adequate housing and nutrition, and ensure Marcus receives appropriate medical and educational support. If at any point during this year Ms. Vance determines that you're unable to meet these requirements, we'll revisit this decision. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Thomas managed, his voice rough with emotion. And Marcus, if at any point you feel unsafe or uncared for, you can contact Ms. Vance directly. This is about your well-being, not about anyone else's ego. Understood? Yes, Your Honor, Marcus said. Judge Sellers struck her gavel once. Temporary guardianship is granted. Next case. They walked out of the courthouse into the July heat, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Marcus turned to Thomas with tears streaming down his face and said, "We did it. We actually did it." Thomas pulled him into a hug, right there on the courthouse steps, not caring who saw or what they thought. "Yeah, kid, we did." Wallace joined them a moment later, a rare smile crossing his usually stern face. "Congratulations. Now comes the hard part, proving her right for the next year." "We will," Thomas said, and for the first time in months, he actually believed it. The year ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. They'd still struggle financially. There would still be nights when he had to choose between buying groceries and paying a utility bill on time. There would still be moments of doubt and fear and exhaustion. But they'd face it together as a family that had chosen each other when no one else would. And sometimes, Thomas thought, as they drove home with Marcus, chattering excitedly about what they should do to celebrate, sometimes that choice was worth more than all the money in the world. The year of temporary guardianship passed in a blur of quarterly check-ins, careful budgeting and small victories that felt monumental. Patricia Vance arrived every 3 months with her clipboard and scrutinizing eyes, inspecting the refrigerator, reviewing Marcus's report cards, asking questions about their routines and their finances. Each visit felt like a test Thomas wasn't sure he was passing, but each time, Patricia signed her forms and left with a nod that suggested they were doing well enough. Marcus transformed during that year in ways that went beyond physical growth, though he did shoot up 5 inches and finally started filling out the frame that had been skeletal when they'd met. He joined the school's debate team in September, initially as a way to pad his transcript, but eventually because he discovered he had a talent for constructing arguments and thinking on his feet. Thomas attended every tournament he could, sitting in the audience and watching Marcus dismantle opposing arguments with a precision that made him simultaneously proud and slightly terrified of what this kid might become. The final guardianship hearing in July 2021 was anticlimactic compared to the first. Judge Sellers reviewed Patricia's reports, noted Marcus's continued academic success and Thomas's stable employment, and granted permanent guardianship with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Mr. Brennan, you've proven that financial stability isn't always measured in dollars," she said from the bench. "Guardianship is granted permanently. Take care of each other." They celebrated with pizza from Giovanni's, the expensive place on Main Street that Thomas had been avoiding for 2 years. For one night, budget be damned, they ordered the large supreme with extra cheese and ate until they were stuffed, laughing about nothing and everything, while the summer evenings stretched long and golden outside the windows. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Thomas asked, watching Marcus polish off his 4th slice with the efficiency of a teenager whose metabolism could incinerate anything. Marcus paused mid-bite, considering the question with an uncharacteristic seriousness. "Rich," he said finally. "I want to be so rich that I never have to worry about money again. That neither of us ever has to worry about money again." It wasn't the answer Thomas had expected. He'd been prepared for something about helping others or changing the world, the kind of aspirational answer that teenagers gave when they thought adults wanted to hear it. But Marcus's honesty was refreshing, even if it revealed a mercenary streak that probably shouldn't have surprised Thomas, given what the kid had been through. "Rich, how?" Thomas asked. "Lawyer, doctor, professional athlete? I don't know yet. But I'm going to figure it out." Marcus set down his pizza, his expression hardening with determination. "I'm not going to let us struggle like this forever. You gave me everything when you had nothing. When I make it, I'm going to pay you back for every single dollar you spent on me, plus interest. Marcus, that's not how this works. That's exactly how it works." Marcus's voice carried a fierce intensity that silenced Thomas's protest. "You chose me when no one else would. You fought for me. You sacrificed for me. I'm not going to forget that, and I'm not going to let you retire on a teacher's pension, living in a house with windows that don't close properly. When I make it, not if, when, I'm going to take care of you the way you took care of me." Thomas wanted to argue, to explain that he hadn't done any of it expecting repayment. But looking at Marcus's face, at the stubborn set of his jaw and the fire in his eyes, he realized this was important. Not for Thomas, but for Marcus. The kid needed to believe he could pay this debt, even if Thomas had never considered it a debt at all. "Okay," Thomas said simply. "Then I'll be here when you make it." High school brought new challenges. Marcus attended Millbrook High, where the building was somehow more depressing than the middle school. All cinder block walls and fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a vaguely sickly appearance. But Marcus thrived anyway, throwing himself into academics with a single-minded intensity that sometimes worried Thomas. He took every AP class available, joined the business club, and spent his weekends reading books about entrepreneurship and investment strategies that he checked out from the library. At 15, he started a small lawn-mowing business in the neighborhood, charging reasonable rates and undercutting the established services. By 16, he'd hired 2 classmates to help him and expanded to 3 neighborhoods. By 17, he'd saved $4,000 and invested it in stocks he'd researched obsessively, turning it into $6,200 by the time he graduated. "He's going to burn out," Sarah Martinez said to Thomas one afternoon when she'd come over for coffee. She'd become something of an unofficial aunt to Marcus over the years. Showing up periodically with groceries, she claimed she'd over-purchased, and staying for dinner to tell increasingly elaborate stories about her classroom disasters. "He's working harder than any teenager I've ever seen. It's not healthy." "I've tried talking to him about balance," Thomas said, watching through the window as Marcus mowed Mrs. Henderson's lawn with methodical precision. "He doesn't listen. He's convinced that working harder than everyone else is the only way to succeed. Wonder where he learned that, Sarah said pointedly. And Thomas had the grace to look embarrassed. The truth was, Marcus had learned it from watching Thomas navigate 6 years of barely making ends meet. He'd seen Thomas grade papers at midnight after a full day of teaching. He'd watched Thomas compare prices on every item at the grocery store, calculating unit costs in his head to find the best deals. He'd witnessed Thomas patch his own clothes rather than buy new ones, drive a car that was held together by duct tape and prayers, and smile through all of it while insisting everything was fine. Marcus had learned that success required sacrifice, and now he was sacrificing everything: his social life, his free time, his teenage years, in pursuit of the financial security that had always eluded their household. College applications became Marcus's singular focus during his senior year. He applied to 15 schools, targeting institutions with the best business programs and the most generous financial aid packages. Thomas watched him labor over essays at the kitchen table night after night, revising and polishing until every word felt essential. "What are you writing about?" Thomas asked one evening in November, setting down a cup of coffee next to Marcus's laptop. "The night I showed up on your doorstep," Marcus said without looking up. "The essay prompt is about a moment that changed your life." Seemed appropriate. Thomas read over his shoulder, and the words hit him harder than he'd expected. Marcus wrote with clinical precision about being 12 years old and starving, about making the calculated decision to knock on a stranger's door because the alternative was freezing to death in a bus station. He wrote about watching Thomas crack the last 2 eggs in his refrigerator and toast half a loaf of bread, understanding even then that this man was giving him everything. "You're going to make me cry in my own kitchen," Thomas said, his voice rough. "Good. If it makes you cry, it'll make the admissions officers cry. And crying admissions officers give out scholarships." Marcus finally looked up, a hint of his old vulnerability showing through the armor of ambition. "Do you think it's too manipulative, using our story like this?" "I think it's honest. And if being honest about what you've survived gets you into a good school with financial aid, then use every word of it." The acceptance letters started arriving in March. Marcus got into 12 of the 15 schools he'd applied to, with varying levels of financial aid. The best offer came from Westfield University, a mid-tier private institution 3 hours away that offered him a full tuition scholarship plus a stipend for books and housing. It wasn't Harvard or Stanford, but it was a legitimate path forward. And the financial package meant Marcus wouldn't graduate with crushing debt. "I'm taking it," Marcus announced at dinner the night the offer arrived. "Full ride, good business program, and close enough that I can come home on weekends if you need me." "If I need you?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Marcus, I've been an adult longer than you've been alive. I think I can manage weekends without supervision. You say that now, but who's going to stop you from eating cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row?" "That happened once, and I was sick." "It happened 4 times last semester alone." They bickered good-naturedly through dinner, but later that night, after Marcus had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in the living room and let himself feel the full weight of what was coming. In 4 months, Marcus would leave for college, and this house would be empty again. After 6 years of having someone to cook for, someone to worry about, someone to give his life structure and purpose, Thomas would return to the solitude he'd known before that December night. He should have been happy. Marcus was going to college, achieving things Thomas had only dreamed of at that age. But instead, he felt hollowed out by the approaching loss. Marcus's graduation in May was a sweltering affair held on the football field, with 200 sweating students in royal blue caps and gowns listening to speeches about limitless potential and following dreams. Thomas sat in the bleachers next to Sarah Martinez and Wallace Hunt, who'd insisted on attending despite barely knowing Marcus. "That kid's going places," Wallace said, as Marcus crossed the stage to receive his diploma, his name called out with a small notation about his full scholarship to Westfield. "Mark my words, Thomas. In 20 years, you're going to see his name in the news. In a good way, I hope, Sarah added. Not like local man arrested for elaborate Ponzi scheme or something. He's too honest for that, Thomas said, though part of him wondered. Marcus had developed a ruthless streak when it came to business and success. He calculated risk like other teenagers calculated video game strategies, and he approached every opportunity as something to be leveraged. It was admirable and slightly concerning in equal measure. After the ceremony, they took photos in front of the school. Marcus in his cap and gown, Thomas in the same suit he'd worn to court hearings and parent-teacher conferences, both of them grinning despite the heat. Sarah insisted on getting copies made, declaring that she needed photographic evidence that her favorite pseudo-nephew had actually survived high school. Summer passed too quickly. Marcus worked his lawn mowing business up until the week before he left, determined to save every possible dollar. He'd accumulated nearly $9,000 in his savings account from 3 years of aggressive work and careful investment. And he talked about it constantly, not with pride. Exactly, but with the relief of someone who'd been drowning and finally found solid ground. That's my emergency fund, he explained to Thomas, while packing his belongings into the 2 suitcases and 3 boxes that constituted everything he owned. If something happens, if you lose your job or the car breaks down or whatever, we have a cushion now. We're not living paycheck to paycheck anymore. That's your college fund, Thomas corrected. You're going to need money for expenses that the scholarship doesn't cover. The scholarship covers everything essential. This is for emergencies. Marcus folded another shirt with military precision, his movements efficient and practiced. Promise me you'll call if you need money. Promise me you won't just suffer in silence the way you always do. I promise, Thomas lied, knowing he'd never take money from a college student who'd already sacrificed too much of his childhood. They loaded Marcus's belongings into Thomas's ancient Honda on a humid August morning, the car groaning under the weight of boxes filled with textbooks, clothes, and the small television Sarah had donated when she'd upgraded her own. The 3-hour drive to Westfield, University passed in comfortable silence broken by occasional conversations about class schedules and dorm policies. The campus was beautiful in that calculated way that private universities managed: brick buildings covered in ivy, manicured lawns, students who looked like they'd stepped out of a catalogue for successful young people. Thomas felt distinctly out of place in his faded jeans and 10-year-old polo shirt, surrounded by parents in expensive casual wear, unloading SUVs packed with mini-fridges and color-coordinated bedding sets. Marcus's roommate was a kid named Derek Walsh from Connecticut, whose father owned a chain of car dealerships. Derek took one look at Marcus's 2 suitcases and barely used laptop and offered a smile that managed to be both friendly and pitying. "Traveling light, huh?" Derek said, gesturing to his own mountain of possessions that included a gaming computer, a 40-inch television, and what appeared to be an entire kitchen's worth of small appliances. "Easier to move that way," Marcus replied neutrally, and Thomas felt a surge of pride at his restraint. The old Marcus, the one who'd shown up on his doorstep, would have either shut down completely or lashed out. This Marcus simply unpacked his suitcase and ignored the implicit judgment. The goodbye in the parking lot was briefer than Thomas had expected. He pulled Marcus into a hug, feeling the solid weight of the young man the boy had become, and tried to think of something profound to say. Some wisdom to impart, some final lesson that would matter. "Call me if you need anything," was what came out, inadequate and cliché. "I will. And you call me too, even if it's just to tell me about your day or complain about your students." Marcus pulled back, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Thank you. For everything. I wouldn't be here without you. You would have found a way. You're the most determined person I've ever met. Maybe, but I found a better way because you helped me." Marcus stepped back toward the dormitory, lifting one hand in a wave. "I'll see you at Thanksgiving. Don't eat too much cereal." Thomas drove home in silence, the car feeling cavernously empty without Marcus's presence. When he pulled into his driveway and walked into his house, the quiet was suffocating. No television playing in the background. No sounds of Marcus moving around upstairs. No sense of another person existing in the same space. Just Thomas, alone again, in a house that felt haunted by 6 years of memories. He made it until 9 p.m. before he called Sarah. He's been gone for 8 hours, and you're already having a crisis, she said without preamble when she picked up. I'm coming over. Do you have wine? No, I'll bring wine. Don't make any major life decisions before I get there. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later with a bottle of red wine and a bag of Chinese takeout. They ate on the couch while Thomas tried to articulate the strange emptiness that had settled over everything. You raised him, Sarah said simply. He was your kid for 6 years. Of course it hurts to let him go. That's what being a parent feels like. I'm not his parent. I'm just the guy who took him in. Thomas, you're the closest thing to a father that boy has ever had. You fought for him, sacrificed for him, shaped who he became. That makes you his parent in every way that matters. She refilled his wineglass. And now you get to do what all parents do when their kids leave for college. You get to miss them while being proud of them. And you get to figure out who you are when your entire identity isn't wrapped up in taking care of someone else. It was the most insight Sarah had offered in years of friendship, and it hit Thomas squarely in the chest. He'd spent 6 years being Marcus's guardian, and before that, he'd spent 15 years being a teacher. When had he last done something just for himself? When had he last pursued a hobby or an interest that wasn't connected to his work or his responsibility to Marcus? I don't know who I am outside of taking care of people, Thomas admitted quietly. Then I guess you have 4 years to figure it out before Marcus graduates and tries to move back in to take care of you, Sarah said. Drink your wine. Eat your kung pao chicken. Tomorrow you can start having your midlife crisis, but tonight we're just going to sit here and acknowledge that you did something incredible, and it's okay to feel weird about it being over. They sat in comfortable silence, eating Chinese food and drinking wine, while the house settled around them. Outside, Millbrook continued its evening routines. Cars passing, dogs barking, neighbors calling children inside for bedtime. Life went on as it always did, indifferent to individual moments of transition and loss. But Thomas allowed himself this one night to mourn the end of an era, to miss the kid who'd become his son in everything but paperwork, and to wonder what came next for a man who'd spent his entire adult life teaching children about other people's stories while barely living his own. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to be Thomas Brennan again, whoever that was. Tonight, he just let himself feel the empty space Marcus had left behind. Marcus called every Sunday at 7 p.m., without fail. Thomas came to structure his weekends around those calls, finishing his grading by 6:30 and settling into the worn armchair by the window with a cup of coffee, waiting for his phone to ring. The conversations followed a pattern. Marcus would talk rapidly about his classes, his projects, the networking events he'd attended, all delivered with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who'd found their element. Thomas would share smaller updates, a particularly difficult student, a staff meeting that ran too long, the mundane details of a life that felt increasingly ordinary compared to Marcus's trajectory. I'm taking an extra class this semester, Marcus announced during their 3rd Sunday call in September. Introduction to Venture Capital. It's not required for my major, but Professor Chen, different Chen, no relation, said it could be useful for understanding startup funding. That's 5 classes plus your work-study job, Thomas said, unable to keep the concern from his voice. When are you sleeping? Sleep is for people who aren't trying to change their circumstances. Marcus's tone was light, but Thomas heard the edge underneath. I'm fine, Thomas. Better than fine. I'm exactly where I need to be. Just don't burn yourself out. You have 4 years to learn everything. You don't have to absorb it all in the first semester. 4 years is nothing. Every semester I'm not maximizing my potential is a semester wasted. There was a pause. Then Marcus's voice softened slightly. I know you're worried, but I promise I'm taking care of myself. I'm eating real food, going to my classes, and I haven't pulled more than 3 all-nighters this month. 3 all-nighters is not the reassurance you think it is. Marcus laughed, and they moved on to safer topics. But after they hung up, Thomas sat in his chair long after the coffee had gone cold, staring out the window and wondering if he'd somehow instilled the wrong lessons. He'd taught Marcus about hard work and sacrifice, but had he forgotten to teach him about rest? About enjoying life for something other than its utility in achieving future goals? Thanksgiving break arrived in late November, and Thomas cleaned the house with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. He'd taken Friday off from school, giving himself a 4-day weekend to spend with Marcus. He'd planned meals, real meals, not the haphazard combinations he'd been surviving on, and stocked the refrigerator with Marcus's favorites: orange juice, the expensive peanut butter with the oil on top, strawberries that cost twice as much as they should in November. Marcus arrived Wednesday evening in a car Thomas didn't recognize, a sleek silver sedan that looked like it cost more than Thomas made in 6 months. "Whose car is that?" Thomas asked, standing in the doorway as Marcus grabbed a duffel bag from the trunk. "Derek's. He let me borrow it for the drive home, since I don't have one." Marcus locked the car with a key fob that chirped twice. "Said it was easier than trying to coordinate our schedules." "That's generous of him. Derek's good people. His family has money, but he doesn't act like it matters." Marcus climbed the porch steps and pulled Thomas into a hug that lifted him slightly off the ground. "When had the kid gotten so strong? I missed you. The dorm smells like mold and desperation, and my roommate's gaming habit is testing my commitment to non-violence." They fell into an easy rhythm over the next 4 days, cooking together, watching old movies, talking about everything and nothing. But Thomas noticed changes in Marcus that went beyond the physical. He dressed differently now, not expensive exactly, but more put together, like he'd studied what successful people wore and replicated it on a budget. He checked his phone constantly, scrolling through emails and messages even during dinner, and he talked about his classmates with a strange mixture of admiration and calculation, categorizing them by their potential usefulness to his future rather than as actual friends. "There's this guy in my finance class, Brandon Yates," Marcus said over Thanksgiving dinner, serving himself a second helping of mashed potatoes. "His dad runs a hedge fund in New York. I've been studying with him, helping him understand the material, and he's invited me to their place in the Hamptons next summer." "That's nice. You're making friends." "I'm making connections," Marcus corrected. "Brandon's a good guy, but more importantly, he's access to a world I'd never reach on my own. His dad gives guest lectures at Wharton, sits on boards of major companies. If I can get Brandon to introduce me during the summer, it could open doors." Thomas set down his fork, studying Marcus's face. "Do you actually like Brandon? Or is he just a means to an end? Why can't he be both?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "You taught me that the world doesn't hand things to people like us. We have to be smart, strategic. Brandon comes from privilege. He'll have opportunities whether he's brilliant or mediocre. I don't have that luxury. So yeah, I'm cultivating relationships with people who can help me. That's not using them, that's networking. There's a line between networking and manipulation, and I'm not crossing it. I genuinely help Brandon with his coursework. I'm a good friend to him. But I'm also aware that friendship can be mutually beneficial, and I'm not going to apologize for playing the same game everyone else at that school is playing." Marcus's expression hardened. "You taught me to be honest about what I want and to work for it. That's what I'm doing." Thomas wanted to argue, to point out that there was something cold in Marcus's calculus, something that reduced human relationships to transactions. But looking at the determination in Marcus's eyes, he recognized something of himself, the drive that had kept him working 2 jobs, the stubbornness that had made him fight for guardianship when everyone said he couldn't afford it. Marcus had learned from him, for better or worse. "Just don't lose yourself in the pursuit," Thomas said finally. "Money isn't everything," says the man who went hungry so I could eat. Marcus's voice was gentle but firm. "I know you mean well, but you also know what poverty costs. It costs dignity and opportunity and peace of mind. I'm not chasing money because I'm greedy. I'm chasing it because I never want either of us to feel that fear again." They finished dinner in contemplative silence, and later that night, Thomas lay awake, wondering if he'd somehow failed Marcus by letting him see too much of the struggle. Had he burdened this kid with his own anxieties about money? Had his fear of poverty become Marcus's driving obsession? The years of college passed in a blur of Sunday phone calls and brief visits. Marcus came home for Thanksgiving and part of Christmas break, but his summers disappeared into internships and networking opportunities. After freshman year, he interned at a consulting firm in Chicago. After sophomore year, he worked for a venture capital company in Boston, sleeping on Derek's cousin's couch to avoid paying rent. Junior year brought a coveted position at a tech startup in San Francisco, where he lived with 4 other interns in a 2-bedroom apartment and worked 90-hour weeks for minimum wage and the promise of experience. Thomas watched from a distance as Marcus built a life that increasingly had nothing to do with Millbrook or the small house on Maple Street. Marcus's social media, which he maintained with the precision of a marketing professional, showed him at industry conferences, networking events, startup launch parties. He posed with people whose names Thomas vaguely recognized from business news, always dressed well, always smiling with that calculated confidence that successful people seem to radiate. "He's outgrowing you," Sarah said bluntly during one of their regular coffee sessions at Thomas's kitchen table. She'd taken to visiting every other week, claiming she needed to make sure Thomas was eating properly, though they both knew it was really about making sure he wasn't drowning in loneliness. "I know. That doesn't mean he's abandoning you. It just means he's becoming his own person in a world that's very different from yours." Sarah stirred her coffee, studying Thomas's face. "How are you handling it?" "I'm proud of him. Everything he's achieving, it's extraordinary. Kid went from eating out of dumpsters to rubbing elbows with venture capitalists in less than a decade. That's the American dream, right?" "That's not what I asked," Thomas sighed, abandoning the pretense. "I feel like I'm losing him to a world I don't understand. We still talk every Sunday, but the conversations are getting shorter. He's busy, I get that. But sometimes I wonder if he even needs me anymore, or if I'm just this obligation he maintains out of guilt." "He loves you, Thomas. That much is obvious from the way he talks about you. He talks about me." "To anyone who'll listen, I ran into him at the grocery store last Christmas, and he spent 20 minutes telling me about how you taught him to research investment strategies using library books because you couldn't afford internet. He talks about you like you're his hero." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Then why does it feel like I'm losing him?" "Because you are a little bit. But that's what's supposed to happen. You raised him to be independent, to chase opportunities, to build the life he wanted. You succeeded. Now you have to figure out how to be happy about your success, even though it means being lonely." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Welcome to parenthood. It's mostly pride mixed with abandonment issues." Marcus graduated summa cum laude in May 2025, 4 years after arriving at Westfield. Thomas attended the ceremony with Sarah and Wallace, sitting in bleachers that were somehow even more uncomfortable than the high school ones had been. When Marcus's name was called, Marcus Chen, Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, summa cum laude, recipient of the Henderson Prize for Academic Excellence. Thomas stood and cheered with an enthusiasm that earned him amused looks from the more reserved parents around him. After the ceremony, they gathered for photos in front of the university's iconic clock tower. Marcus wore his cap and gown over a suit that looked expensive, probably borrowed or bought second-hand, but tailored to fit him perfectly. He posed with his degree, with Thomas, with Sarah and Wallace, documenting a moment that felt both celebratory and final. "I got a job," Marcus announced at dinner that evening, after they'd returned to Millbrook and gathered at Giovanni's for pizza, a tradition they'd maintained since the day permanent guardianship was granted. "I'm starting in July at Meridian Ventures. It's a venture capital firm in Manhattan, junior analyst position, 60-hour weeks minimum, but the salary is $95,000 plus bonuses." The number hit Thomas like physical force. $95,000, more than twice what Thomas made after 20 years of teaching. That's incredible, Thomas managed, pushing down the complicated mix of emotions. Pride, yes, but also something that felt uncomfortably like envy and loss. Congratulations. It's just the start. Junior analysts are basically the bottom of the ladder, but it's the right ladder. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. This is what I've been working toward. Meridian invests in early-stage tech companies. I'll be analyzing deals, conducting due diligence, learning from some of the smartest investors in the industry. 3 to 5 years there, and I can either move to a better firm or start my own. So you'll be in New York, Sarah said. And Thomas was grateful she'd voiced what he couldn't. Yeah, I found a place in Brooklyn with 2 roommates, other junior analysts from different firms. Rent's insane, but splitting it 3 ways makes it manageable. Marcus glanced at Thomas, and for just a moment the old vulnerability showed through. I'll still call every Sunday, and I'll come visit when I can. New York is only 5 hours away, I know. I'm proud of you, Marcus. This is everything you worked for, and it was. Thomas was proud, but he was also aware that the distance between their lives was about to become geographical as well as circumstantial. Marcus was moving to New York City to work in venture capital, and Thomas was staying in Millbrook to teach 7th graders about metaphors and persuasive essays. Their paths had diverged, and there was no pretending otherwise. Marcus moved to New York in late June, hiring a U-Haul for his belongings that somehow filled the entire cargo space, despite him having arrived at college with just 2 suitcases. Thomas helped him unpack in the cramped Brooklyn apartment that cost $2,400 a month for Marcus's single room, more than Thomas's entire house payment. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a walk-up building with narrow stairs and peeling paint, but Marcus toured it like it was a palace. This is it, he said, standing in his empty room with its single window overlooking a brick wall. This is where I prove myself. Thomas wanted to tell him he'd already proven himself, that graduating summa cum laude and landing a job at a prestigious firm was proof enough. But he recognized the hunger in Marcus's voice, the same hunger that had driven him to mow lawns at 15 and take extra classes at 19. Marcus wasn't trying to prove himself to the world. He was trying to prove himself to that 12-year-old kid who'd collapsed on a doorstep, starving and desperate. They said goodbye on the sidewalk outside the apartment, with New York City flowing around them in a chaos of cars and pedestrians and sounds that never seemed to stop. "Thank you," Marcus said, pulling Thomas into a hug. "For everything. I'm going to make you proud. You already have. No, I mean really proud. The kind of proud where you don't have to worry about money anymore, where you can retire comfortably, where you can fix the windows in your house and buy a car that doesn't need duct tape to hold it together." Marcus pulled back, his grip tight on Thomas's shoulders. "Give me a few years. I'm going to change both our lives." Thomas drove back to Millbrook alone, the 5-hour trip passing in a fog of radio static and highway miles. When he pulled into his driveway and walked into his empty house, he stood in the doorway and let himself feel the full weight of solitude. For 6 years, Marcus had filled this space. For 4 years before that, Thomas had at least had the structure of their Sunday calls and holiday visits. Now Marcus was building a life in New York City, working 60-hour weeks and probably eating bodega sandwiches for dinner, and Thomas was here, alone, middle-aged, teaching the same lessons he'd taught for 20 years. His phone rang at 7 p.m. that Sunday. "Exactly on schedule. How's the new job?" Thomas asked, settling into his chair with his coffee. "Brutal, amazing, terrifying." Marcus sounded exhausted but exhilarated. "I'm learning so much it feels like my brain is going to explode. We're looking at a deal for a fintech startup that could revolutionize mobile payments. The numbers are insane. They're asking for $15 million in Series A funding. Do you understand what any of that means?" "Not yet, but I will." Marcus paused. "How are you?" "Really, I'm fine. School starts in 2 months. I'm enjoying the quiet." "Liar, you hate the quiet." You've spent your entire adult life surrounded by people. Another pause, longer this time. I wish I could be there more. I wish I could take care of you the way you took care of me. I don't need taking care of, Marcus. I need you to build the life you want. That's all I've ever wanted. I'm going to pay you back, Marcus said, and Thomas heard the fierce determination that had become his defining characteristic. Every sacrifice you made, every dollar you spent, every meal you skipped, I'm going to pay it all back with interest. Just give me time. I never kept a tab, I know. But I did. After they hung up, Thomas sat in the growing darkness and wondered what Marcus's ledger looked like. How do you quantify kindness? How do you calculate the value of choosing to help someone when you barely had enough for yourself? And more importantly, how do you explain to someone you love that the debt they're so desperate to repay never existed in the first place? The years rolled forward with increasing speed. Marcus called every Sunday without fail, though the calls grew shorter as his responsibilities increased. He was promoted to senior analyst after 2 years, then to associate after 4. His salary climbed into 6 figures, and his Instagram showed him at industry conferences around the world: Singapore, London, Dubai. He posed with tech founders and fellow investors. Always impeccably dressed, always confident, Thomas continued teaching at Millbrook Middle School, watching a parade of 7th graders discover the magic and frustration of literature. He turned 50, then 52. His hair went gray at the temples. His Honda finally died and had to be replaced with a slightly less ancient Toyota. The house on Maple Street continued its slow deterioration. Another pipe leak, shingles blown off in a storm, the heating system wheezing through each winter like it might give up at any moment. You should ask Marcus for help. Sarah said one particularly cold January evening, when Thomas's heating system had failed completely, and they were sitting at his kitchen table wearing coats. That boy has money now. He'd fix this in a heartbeat. He has student loans and New York rent. He doesn't need to be subsidizing my heating repairs. Thomas, pride is going to freeze you to death. You either call Marcus or call a repairman and put it on a payment plan. Thomas called a repairman and put it on a payment plan. 3 months later, when his car's transmission failed, he took the bus to school for 2 weeks before finally buying a used replacement that cost $3,500 he didn't have, adding another monthly payment to his already strained budget. He never told Marcus about any of it. When they talked on Sundays, Thomas kept the conversation light and positive, asking about Marcus's work and listening to stories about deals and investments that might as well have been in a foreign language. Marcus seemed happy, driven and exhausted, but genuinely thriving in the world he'd fought so hard to enter. I'm working on something big, Marcus said during a call in March 2029, nearly 4 years after he'd graduated college. Can't talk about it yet, but if it works out the way I think it will, it's going to be life-changing. Just trust me, okay? I always trust you, Thomas replied, though he had no idea what Marcus was talking about. Good, because I haven't forgotten my promise. I'm going to take care of you. Thomas, soon. I just need a little more time. But time, Thomas was learning, had a way of stretching infinitely when you were living alone in a cold house, teaching the same lessons year after year, waiting for Sunday phone calls that grew shorter with each passing week. He was proud of Marcus, fiercely, unconditionally proud. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that he'd given everything to help Marcus build a rocket ship. And now he was standing on the ground, watching it disappear into the stratosphere, too far away to reach. December 14th, 2039, 20 years to the day since Marcus Chen had collapsed on Thomas Brennan's doorstep. Thomas stood at his classroom window during lunch period, watching snow fall over the Millbrook Middle School parking lot, and wondered if Marcus even remembered the date. Their Sunday calls had dwindled to monthly check-ins over the past 2 years, each conversation shorter than the last, filled with Marcus's apologetic explanations about deals closing and time zones and investors who needed attention. Thomas was 58 now. His hair had gone completely grey, and his back ached from too many years of standing in front of whiteboards. He'd submitted his retirement paperwork that morning, effective at the end of the school year. 35 years of teaching, and he'd have a pension that would cover his basic expenses if he was careful. The house was paid off, that was something. He could survive on teacher's pension and Social Security, live simply, maybe finally read all those books he'd been meaning to get to. It was a modest plan for a modest life, and Thomas had made peace with it. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Marcus, don't make plans for this weekend. Coming to visit. Need to talk to you about something important." Thomas stared at the message, trying to decode its tone. Marcus hadn't visited Millbrook in over a year, and he'd never announced a visit with such cryptic urgency. Something important could mean anything. Maybe he was getting married, or maybe he'd lost his job. Or maybe he'd finally burned out from the relentless pace he'd maintained for a decade. Thomas texted back, "Everything okay?" The response came immediately. "Better than okay. See you Saturday, 2 p.m. Saturday arrived cold and bright, the kind of December day where everything looked crystalline and fragile. Thomas cleaned the house with the same nervous energy he'd had before Marcus's first visit home from college, though he wasn't sure why he was anxious. This was Marcus, the kid he'd raised. The young man who called him every month without fail, even if the calls were brief. At 1:45 p.m., Thomas heard cars pulling up outside. Not a car, cars, plural. He looked out the window and felt his stomach drop. 3 black SUVs were parking along Maple Street, their polished surfaces completely out of place in his working-class neighborhood. Neighbors were already coming out onto their porches, staring at the convoy with open curiosity. Marcus stepped out of the middle vehicle, and Thomas barely recognized him. The lanky teenager had become a man who moved with absolute confidence. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Thomas's monthly pension would be. And he was followed by 3 other people, a woman in her 30s, carrying a leather portfolio, and 2 men in suits who had the unmistakable bearing of lawyers or executives. Thomas opened the door before Marcus could knock, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then Marcus smiled, that same smile he'd had as a kid, the one that transformed his face from calculating to genuinely warm, and pulled Thomas into a hug that lifted him off his feet. "I missed you," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "God, I missed you so much. I missed you too." Thomas pulled back, studying Marcus's face. "What's with the entourage?" "That's what I need to talk to you about. Can we come in?" Thomas stepped aside, and suddenly his small living room was filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a financial magazine. The woman with the portfolio introduced herself as Jessica Torres, Marcus's chief operating officer. The 2 men were Daniel Kim, his attorney, and Robert Chen, no relation, his financial advisor. "Marcus, what's going on?" Thomas asked, his anxiety spiking. "Are you in trouble?" "No, the opposite, actually." Marcus sat on the couch, the same couch he'd slept on that first night 20 years ago, and gestured for Thomas to sit beside him. "Thomas, I need to tell you what I've been doing for the past 4 years. The thing I said I couldn't talk about back in 2029, you said it was going to be life-changing. It was. I left Meridian Ventures in 2030 and started my own investment firm, Chen Capital. We focus on early-stage tech startups, finding companies that have potential but need capital and guidance to scale." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes bright with the intensity Thomas remembered from his teenage years. "Our first major investment was in a company called Streamline AI. They developed software that revolutionized supply chain logistics. We got in early with $5 million. 3 years later, Amazon acquired them for $2.8 billion. Thomas tried to process the numbers and couldn't. Billion. With a B. Our stake was worth $340 million after the acquisition." Marcus said it calmly, like he was discussing the weather. "But that was 2 years ago. Since then, we've had 3 more major exits. We've invested in 17 companies across tech, biotech, and clean energy. Chen Capital currently manages a portfolio worth approximately $1.9 billion. The silence in the room was absolute. Thomas stared at Marcus, searching for signs that this was some kind of elaborate joke. but Marcus's expression was completely serious. Jessica Torres opened her portfolio and pulled out a document that she handed to Thomas. "These are the basics," she said gently. "Obviously, it's a lot to take in." Thomas looked at the document, charts and graphs and numbers that seemed to have too many zeros. Chen Capital, portfolio companies, valuation, and at the bottom of the page in a section labeled Principal, one name, Marcus Chen, founder and CEO. "I don't understand," Thomas said quietly. "You're telling me you're a billionaire?" "Not quite. Most of the wealth is tied up in investments and the firm itself. My personal net worth is somewhere around 470 million, depending on market fluctuations." Marcus took Thomas's hand, and Thomas realized his was shaking. "I wanted to tell you earlier. Every Sunday we talked, I wanted to tell you what I was building. But I couldn't, not until I was sure it would work. Not until I could make good on my promise." "What promise?" "That I would pay you back. That I would take care of you the way you took care of me." Marcus nodded to Daniel Kim, who pulled out another folder. "I had my team put together a complete accounting. Every dollar you spent on me from December 14th, 2019 until I graduated college. Food, clothing, housing, medical expenses, school supplies, everything. It came to approximately $47,000 over 6.5 years. Marcus, you don't owe me. Let me finish, please." Marcus opened the folder, showing Thomas pages of itemized expenses that someone had clearly spent hundreds of hours compiling. "You spent $47,000 on me when you could barely afford to feed yourself. You worked 2 jobs. You went without heat. You skipped meals. You gave up everything to make sure I survived. That's what you do for people you love." "I know. And that's what I'm doing now." Marcus pulled out another document, this one with Thomas's name at the top. "I'm not just paying back the $47,000. That would be insulting. What you gave me wasn't just money, it was opportunity, hope, a future. You gave me everything when you had nothing. So I calculated what that investment would be worth if I paid it back with the same rate of return my firm has averaged over the past decade." Thomas looked at the number on the paper and felt the world tilt. "This says 25 million in a trust fund managed by Robert here. It generates approximately 1.2 million annually in returns, adjusted for inflation. That's your pension, Thomas. That's your retirement. You'd never have to worry about money again. I can't accept this." "Yes, you can. And you will." Marcus's voice was firm but gentle. "Because I've also purchased your house, paid off the mortgage, bought it outright and put it in your name with no liens or debts. And I've hired contractors to completely renovate it. New roof, new windows, new heating system, updated kitchen, whatever you want. The work starts next month." Thomas felt tears streaming down his face before he realized he was crying. "Marcus, this is too much. I didn't help you so you'd pay me back. I know. That's exactly why you deserve this." Marcus was crying too now, tears cutting tracks down his face while he smiled. "You taught me that people matter more than money. That kindness isn't transactional. That you help people because it's right, not because you expect something in return. But you also taught me, whether you meant to or not, that poverty steals dignity. That money might not buy happiness, but the lack of it creates suffering." Jessica Torres handed Thomas a tissue, her own eyes suspiciously bright. Daniel Kim was studying his shoes with intense focus, and Robert Chen had turned away to look out the window. "You spent your entire life teaching kids about other people's stories," Marcus continued. "You never got to live your own story because you were too busy taking care of everyone else. That changes now. You're retiring at the end of this year, right? I saw the paperwork. How did you—" "I called the school, told them I was your son, which is true in every way that matters, and asked about your retirement plans." Marcus pulled out yet another folder. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to retire in June. You're going to spend the summer watching contractors renovate your house. And then you're going to do whatever you want. Travel, read, take up painting, learn to play guitar, volunteer, whatever brings you joy. I don't know how to do any of that. I don't know how to just exist for myself. Then you're going to learn. And I'm going to be here to help you figure it out. Marcus squeezed Thomas's hand. I'm moving back to Millbrook. Not full-time, I still need to be in New York for work. But I bought a house here, 3 streets over on Elm Street. The big Victorian that's been empty for 5 years. I'm having it renovated too. I'll split my time, 3 days in New York, 4 days here. I want to be close to you. I want to have dinner together. I want to make up for all the years I was too busy building an empire to appreciate the man who made that empire possible. Thomas couldn't speak. He pulled Marcus into a hug and sobbed into his shoulder, deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere he didn't know existed. Marcus held him tightly, crying too, while Jessica Torres quietly ushered Daniel Kim and Robert Chen out of the room to give them privacy. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long," Marcus whispered. "I thought I needed to build something massive before I came back. I thought I needed to be successful enough to deserve you. But the truth is, you deserved better than a son who was so obsessed with proving himself that he forgot to just be present." "You're not my son," Thomas said automatically. The old disclaimer. "Yes, I am. In every way that matters, I'm your son. You raised me. You chose me. You fought for me. You saved my life, Thomas. Not just that first night when you fed me, but every day after. You showed me what it meant to be a good man." Marcus pulled back, wiping his eyes with his sleeve like he was still a teenager. "I love you." "I should have said it more often over the years, but I was so focused on this plan, on this grand gesture. I love you, and I'm sorry I let work and distance and time get in the way of showing you that." "I love you too," Thomas said, and saying it out loud felt like unlocking something that had been sealed shut for too long. "I'm so proud of you. Everything you've accomplished, it's extraordinary. I accomplished it because you gave me the foundation, the work ethic, the integrity, the belief that I deserved better than what I'd been given. That was all you." Marcus stood up, pulling Thomas to his feet. "Come on, I want to show you something." They walked outside, followed by Jessica, Daniel, and Robert, who'd been waiting on the porch. Marcus led Thomas to the middle SUV and opened the back door, revealing the interior packed with boxes and folders. "These are college funds," Marcus said, pulling out one of the folders. "I've set up full-ride scholarships for 50 students from Millbrook, kids from low-income families who wouldn't otherwise afford college. It's called the Brennan Scholarship, named after you. The first recipients will be chosen this spring." Thomas stared at the folder, with his name printed on it in gold letters. "Marcus, there's more. I'm donating $10 million to Millbrook Middle School for a complete renovation. New computers, updated textbooks, renovated facilities, and salary increases for teachers. Another $5 million is going to establish the Brennan Center for Educational Excellence, which will provide free tutoring and mentoring for at-risk youth." Marcus pulled out folder after folder, each representing another project. "I'm funding the food bank you used when I first arrived. I'm renovating the community center. I'm establishing a job training program for kids aging out of the foster system." "Why?" Thomas whispered. "Because Millbrook gave me you. This town is full of good people who don't have enough resources. I have more resources than any one person could ever need. So I'm sharing it, the way you shared everything with me when you had almost nothing." Marcus closed the SUV door and turned to face Thomas. "I'm not doing this for recognition or tax breaks or to make myself feel important. I'm doing this because you taught me that we have a responsibility to help people when we can. You could have turned me away that night. You could have called the cops and let the system handle me. Instead, you fed me with your last 2 eggs and let me sleep on your couch. And it changed the trajectory of my entire life." Neighbors had gathered on the street now, watching the scene unfold with open curiosity. Mrs. Henderson from next door, who'd let Marcus mow her lawn for extra money when he was 15. The Johnsons from across the street, who'd always waved when they saw Thomas coming home from school. Sarah Martinez's car pulled up, and she got out with an expression of shock that suggested she'd heard rumors and come to investigate. "Is it true?" Sarah called out, walking toward them. "Are you Marcus Chen?" "The Marcus Chen from Chen Capital." "Yes, ma'am." Marcus walked over and shook her hand. "You're Ms. Martinez. You helped Thomas organize food drives when I first arrived." "I remember. You remember me?" "I remember everyone who helped us when we had nothing. You, Principal Donovan, Wallace Hunt, Dr. Kim, all the teachers who contributed to those food boxes. I've been compiling a list for the past 2 years." Marcus gestured to Jessica, who pulled out another folder. "Everyone who helped Thomas help me is receiving a thank you gift. In your case, Ms. Martinez, it's a $100,000 donation to your classroom, plus a fully funded sabbatical year if you want to pursue advanced education or research." Sarah looked at the document Jessica handed her, then at Marcus, then at Thomas. "This is real. This is actually happening?" "It's real," Thomas confirmed, still dazed. "Apparently, our lives are about to change significantly." More neighbors emerged, drawn by the commotion. Marcus spent the next hour on the street, shaking hands and explaining his plans for Millbrook's revitalization. He was articulate and passionate, explaining how he wanted to create opportunities for kids like he'd been, smart and motivated, but trapped by circumstances. He talked about breaking cycles of poverty through education and mentorship, about building infrastructure that would let people thrive rather than just survive. Thomas watched him hold court on Maple Street and saw the full transformation. This wasn't just the hungry kid who'd collapsed on his doorstep, and it wasn't just the ambitious teenager who'd mowed lawns with desperate intensity. This was a man who'd achieved extraordinary success, but hadn't lost sight of where he'd come from or who'd helped him get there. As the sun started to set and the crowd began to disperse, Marcus walked back to Thomas and put his arm around his shoulders. "I know this is overwhelming," Marcus said quietly. "I know it's a lot to process. But I need you to understand something. This isn't charity. This isn't me trying to buy your approval or assuage my guilt. This is me keeping the promise I made when I was 18 years old. I told you I'd take care of you when I made it. Well, I made it. And now it's your turn to let someone else carry the weight for a while. I don't know how to be taken care of. I've been taking care of other people my entire life. I know. That's why you're going to learn. Starting now." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed Thomas a calendar. "I've booked us a trip to Italy for 3 weeks in July. We're going to eat pasta and look at art and do absolutely nothing productive. I've already cleared it with the school board. They're fine with you leaving early since you're retiring anyway. Marcus, I can't just go to Italy." "Yes, you can. We're going to Venice and Florence and Rome, and we're going to stay in nice hotels, and you're going to order whatever you want from the menu without looking at the prices. And then we're coming back here to your renovated house, and I'm going to teach you how to live without constantly worrying about money." Marcus's voice softened. "You gave me 6 years of your life when you could barely afford to take care of yourself. Give me 3 weeks to show you what you made possible." Thomas looked at Marcus, at the man his son had become, and felt something shift inside his chest. For 20 years, he'd been proud of Marcus from a distance, watching him succeed in a world that felt foreign and inaccessible. But standing here on Maple Street, with the winter sun setting behind them, and neighbors whispering about the miracle that had arrived in 3 black SUVs, Thomas finally understood what Marcus had been building: not just wealth, not just success, but the means to give back everything he'd received, multiplied 1,000 times over. "Okay," Thomas said. "Italy, 3 weeks. But I'm not ordering the most expensive thing on the menu just to prove I can." Marcus laughed, pulling him into another hug. "We'll start with the second most expensive thing and work our way up." They stood together on the street where it had all begun 20 years ago, and Thomas Brennan, who'd spent his entire life teaching children about other people's stories, finally understood that he'd been living inside the greatest story of all. A story about kindness and sacrifice, about choosing to help someone when logic said you couldn't afford to, about the immeasurable returns of investing in another human being. December 14th, 2039. 20 years to the day since a starving boy had knocked on a poor teacher's door. The boy had become a man worth $500 million. The teacher had become a father who'd never asked for repayment, but was receiving it anyway, measured not in money, but in the knowledge that his choice, his simple, illogical, financially irresponsible choice to share his last 2 eggs, had rippled out into the world in ways he could never have imagined. "Thank you," Marcus whispered into the growing darkness, "for seeing me when I was invisible, for feeding me when you were hungry, for choosing me when no one else would. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for giving meaning to mine," Thomas replied. And there, on a quiet street in Millbrook, surrounded by the community that had helped them survive, they stood together, father and son in every way that mattered, and watched the first snow of winter begin to fall. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.